Hello, and welcome everyone to the launch of this research paper for RUSI's Terrorism and the Media project, looking at reporting in the UK. I'm Dr. Liz Pearson. I'm a lecturer at the Cyber Threats Research Centre, CyTREC, at Swansea University, and I'm an associate fellow at RUSI. I'm also a former radio journalist. I'm going to be chairing this event. This is the second in the Terrorism and Media project series. So the paper that's going to be launched today is the result of a special 18-month-long project which was commissioned by the police, specifically by the Office of the Assistant Commissioner of Specialist Operations for the London Metropolitan Police, Neil Basu, QPM. He's the UK's head of counter-terrorism policing. Assistant Commissioner Basu will be the first of this afternoon's speakers in just a few minutes. Dr. Jessica White of RUSI's Terrorism and Conflict Research Group is the author of today's paper. Her first report as part of this research project was called Terrorism and the Mass Media. It was focusing on really analysing the theoretical evidence base on the role of the media in relation to terrorism. Now, with this second paper entitled A Complex Matter, Examining Reporting on Terrorism in the UK, Jess has really documented the various dynamics and factors shaping UK reporting of terrorism and how the news works, when articles on terrorism are published, as well as where, how, what it is that's being put out there. And she's explored how the dynamics of news cycles have impacts, both good and bad, in terrorism reporting. In this paper, she really outlines the role of the police and the audience in this cycle. And the police-media relationship, Jess finds, is really key. Jess, Dr. White is going to explain the paper in detail later in this session. Today, Jess and Neil are also joined by two media experts to discuss the implications of this paper, which I'm sure you're all interested in. Ian Murray, we're welcoming back after participating in the first report and panel. He's the Executive Director of the Society of Editors. The Society is made up of nearly 400 members, and they seek to influence debate on press and broadcasting freedom, ethics, and the culture and business of news media. We're also joined by Charlotte Dewar. She's the Chief Executive of the Independent Press Standards Organisation, IPSO. It's the independent regulator for the large majority of the UK's newspapers and magazines. And IPSO seeks to uphold high standards of journalism and maintain freedom of expression for the press. So Charlotte and Ian, thanks for joining us. They're going to give their reflections and in particular address some of the guidance that's offered in this paper later. I'm looking forward to this conversation. This is going to be an important conversation. Why? Because we know that the media matters in the reporting of crime and the criminal justice system. And it particularly matters in the reporting of terrorism. And that's because, as I discuss endlessly with my students, publicity and the communication of a message to create fear are part of the very definition of terrorism. It is, in fact, one of my favourite essay questions. Without the media, would terrorism exist? Discuss. So recently, there has been a focus on social media and its role in terrorism. But actually, as Jess has already explained, the impact of all media matters. And in particular, how terrorism is reported is crucial for shaping narratives. Public responses to issues such as the return of Islamic State fighters or supporters, including recently Shamima Begum, are to some degree built around media representations of terrorism. Reporting matters. The label jihadi brides still being used by some of the media, for instance, in spite of protest from academics. And it gives a false impression of women's involvement in Islamic State, suggests that they're non-supporters simply married in. False impressions, false narratives mean mistakes in public perception, in policing, in policy. But as we know, the media is not a monolith. It does do a lot of things right, and it is constantly learning, sometimes in response to events, sometimes as the result of research such as that which Jess is presenting today. And responsible reporting is, of course, in balance with press freedoms. So this report is hugely welcome and it is very timely. All four of our presenters this afternoon are going to speak to you for about 10 minutes, and then there is going to be a chance for your questions. So please do use the Q&A function to type those in to us. We've already had some questions from some of you, I know, so thank you very much for those. We'd also ask that your questions try to relate specifically to the subject of the paper being presented today, which is UK reporting on terrorism. And it's great if you can say who your question is intended for. We have got the Q&A open throughout the session, and we're finishing at 3:30. So you will also notice that you have the option to vote for the question that you want to see asked. I should also mention, as you're probably aware, that this event is being recorded. It's going to be posted online when the paper is officially published. The paper is actually embargoed until 4 p.m. today. So if you do want to tweet about it, and we do want you to tweet about it, then we ask that you hold your tweets until then. So I'd like to hand in just a moment to Assistant Commissioner Basu. He's been instrumental in opening debate and conversation about the reporting of terrorism in this country. 2 years ago, he wrote a very memorable open letter to the media following the Christchurch attacks. He was criticising some reporting, and this led to a good deal of police media engagement. He's described his journey from that point to here in a foreword for this paper. And the paper and the research is obviously a result of that conversation. So we're now going to hear Neil Basu's thoughts on this research and its importance to counter-terrorism, to the Met and wider policing. Neil Basu, if I can please now hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. Can you hear me okay? Yes, some nods there. So good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at this launch for what I hope will be a landmark publication. And more important than that, a step change in developing ways of working between counterterrorism, policing and the media. I was delighted when I saw the number of people who had registered for the event and saw who they were. Not least because I've just been told one of them is my old boss and mentor, Sir Mark Rowley, so no pressure on me there at all. And somebody who should take a great credit for opening up the CT world to the media in his tenure in this job. And this is largely following on from that example. Many of you will have been here at the first launch that Liz mentioned in May last year, when virtual events, Zoom calls, home working, all of that was something of a novelty. I think you'll all agree with me, the novelty's long since gone. I sincerely hope that the next time we get together, maybe for a third go round, it will be face to face and not governed by the reliability of our connections here. Our day-to-day lives for all of us have been mostly on hold since the result of the lockdowns, but the work to examine the relationship between the terrorism threat and the media reporting of it has progressed very significantly since the last time we got together to discuss it. That's not just evidenced in Jessica's outstanding report, but the people who are sitting alongside me at this top table. So with Jessica, the lead researcher and author of the paper, you've already heard Ian is with us, from the Executive Director of the Society of Editors, and Charlotte, the CEO of IPSO, the Press Standards Organisation. And Ian, Charlotte and I have had conversations about this very subject very recently, and they've been incredibly enlightening and incredibly useful. The fact that they're sitting here to support the launch of this paper since it began says just how far we've progressed, I think, particularly since that open letter following the Christchurch attack in New Zealand. I was challenging the way that was being reported at the time and the way some other egregious terrorist attacks have been reported. And I was criticising traditional and social media for publicising terrorist propaganda and manifestos. And what I was trying to do was invite editors to debate those issues along with wider society. To say my letter wasn't well received, I think is something of an understatement. I think Liz was very kind to me in her opening. I was robustly challenged by some senior editors and journalists, rightly defending the freedom of the press and public interest. And I will never forget, and I've told many journalists in the past, that the only thing I wanted to do as a child was be a journalist. I was too shy, couldn't get a job on my local paper. So I don't think many of them believe me, but it's true. I wanted to be a writer and a foreign correspondent. But here I am, hopefully not on the opposite side, hopefully persuading that we can do this as a partnership. At this point, I think it's fair to say that gaining the support of the Society of Editors, or IPSO, 2 years ago looked slightly unlikely. We'd certainly sparked a debate, but probably not in the way that I had hoped that we would. 8 months after Christchurch, I was very grateful to be invited, thank you Ian, to the Society of Editors annual conference. And at that conference, I was trying to explain why I had said what I said and hoped for a more constructive conversation going forward. And since then, I've had the privilege of sitting down with some of the country's most senior editors to discuss this work and its implication for policing and the media. My lasting impression of that particular conference was the need to build mutual trust and really to shift this project from an independent counterterrorism policing effort to a collaborative approach backed up by solid academic research and some heavy hitters in the media industry. The subsequent discussions I've had with editors, journalists, and communications professionals have all helped me reshape my understanding of the issue. They highlighted the need to truly understand what is a very complex relationship between terrorism and terrorist reporting, and Liz gave a very good opening introduction of that, and the requirement more so for dispassionate, independent analysis. Where better to go for that kind of gravitas than RUSI, an organisation so often at the forefront of helping us all understand better the threat we face from terrorism and other national security matters. They've led the research push, thanks to Jessica, developed a methodology that ensured media professionals directly informed the qualitative analysis that you've been reading, I hope. This, alongside an exhaustive literature review and innovative quantitative analysis, has closed a research gap. We really did not know what we were talking about until Jessica came on board. At this point, it's important to stress the independence of RUSI's work. Counterterrorism policing asks for no more or no less than an answer to the research question. The resulting body of work, which today culminates in the release of a complex matter examining reporting on terrorism in the UK, a remarkably understated title, Jessica, well done, is a remarkable achievement in itself. RUSI delivered a balanced, unique, and important piece of research under demanding timescales. And I think you'll see that we certainly don't escape the critical lens in this complex matter. So, particular commendation to Jessica White for the rigor, integrity, endless patience producing this work, not least because she's probably had to deal with DCI Will Lexton-Jones sitting opposite me, who deserves a lot of credit for making this happen in a fairly busy day job as he sits directly opposite me, getting shouted at for probably about 14 hours a day. Thank you, Will. There are valuable contributions here from Dr. Paul McFarlane, Dr. Bennett Kleinberg of the UCL. They conducted language sentiment analysis using cutting-edge natural language processing software that delivered a quantitative data set that informs some of the conclusions here about how terrorist reporting is done. And the content of the paper and the collegiate way it was delivered gives me great optimism that terrorism can be reported in a way that both meets public interest needs, but also mitigates and even potentially prevents harm. From this research paper and that which preceded it, three things became very clear. First, the interaction between terrorism and terrorism reporting is far more complicated than simply one driving the other. There is no easy solution for a good or bad way to report terrorism. Second, that counterterrorism policing shares that responsibility and must take steps to put our own house in order about how we report when we stand up in front of the media. And lastly, nothing can be achieved if the relationship between policing and media did not improve. I think in the post-Leveson years, the symbiotic relationship between policing and journalism has been lost. You know, let's just say it out loud. And very many people have been trying to put that back on the right track. The two absolutely need each other. In fact, some of my biggest cases were solved primarily because of the help of sections of the media. So I'm incredibly heartened to see so many journalists, editors, and other interested parties taking part in the proceedings today. I'd like to thank every single person who dedicated their time to speak to Jessica and who contributed to this piece of research. And what came through loud and clear is that I'm not the only one who believes we can make a tangible and positive difference with this piece of work. You all share the great sense of responsibility that we have to the people we're all working for, the public, both to inform them, but to protect them in equal measure. In the spirit of this research and its findings, I pledge you all that counterterrorism policing will take immediate steps to enact the recommendation in this paper, to make changes to the way we work with you in the media, to rebuild the trust between our organisation and yours. And I hope I can count on each of you to join me in accelerating that process and being an advocate for this project when you speak to your fellow journalists and editors. So my job is to counter terrorism in the UK. I was taught very well, thank you, Mark, and to protect its interests overseas. But actually, one of the crucial parts of the person who holds this position is also to reduce the fear of terrorism, not just to stop the attacks. I feel a deep personal sense of responsibility in that, and to explore anything that could move the dial slightly on this. I've always said that it's communities that defeat terrorism, and many of my famous predecessors have said that before me. So we must all do our part and acknowledge that security must never come at the expense of our civil liberties, and very much that includes freedom of speech. Nevertheless, I'm asking the media community to join with me and help defeat both terrorism and the fear it creates. It's taken 2 long, hard years just to get to this place, and this publication is not the end of that journey. It's just the beginning. And we have to work together, I think, to make reporting of terrorism good for the public, bad for the terrorist. So thank you for coming again today. I'm really looking forward to working with you all in the future, and I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks very much, Neil, for that. Now I'm going to move from Neil to Dr. Jessica White, who is going to present her paper, A Complex Matter, Examining Reporting on Terrorism in the UK. Jessica White is from RUSI's Terrorism and Conflict Research Group. She's a research fellow in that group, and her expertise includes countering terrorism and extremism policy and programming. And she's been the lead researcher, as Neil made very clear, throughout this terrorism and media project. But as well as working on the media and terrorism, Jess also has expertise on a number of other issues. She's written on the impact of the pandemic on extremism. She's written on the rising challenges of the far right. She's also an expert in gender and terrorism and countering terrorism. Jess has a PhD from the University of Birmingham, and before she started studying for her PhD, she spent 6 years as an intelligence and language analyst in the United States Navy, where she was also working on counterterrorism issues. So Jess, I shall pass over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz, and thank everyone for coming today. We're very excited to be finally presenting the second part of this project. It's been a long road to get here, I will say. I have learned a great deal along that road myself as part of this project. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. So I'm just going to present, and I'm going to try and be rather quick about it, for about 10 minutes on the paper and the contents of the paper. It was passed around. Hopefully you've all received it yesterday, I believe. So perhaps you've already had a look, but I will cover some of the major topics here in a quick fashion. So this is indeed the second paper of this project. We looked first at the theoretical evidence base. I won't spend too long on this. We called that one Terrorism in the Mass Media, but that sort of focused on the theoretical evidence for potential social impacts of media reporting and the potential role that the media does play. We came out of that with some conclusions, but they were tentative conclusions because we hadn't yet looked at sort of primary evidence of the UK reporting on terrorism. So for the second part of this project, we've really focused in on getting that primary research. And I will say, this was limited by times, frame that we had to work within. So we stuck to national level print media outlets, but we did both interviews with reporters and editors from those outlets, as well as the natural language processing software that Neil mentioned that UCL helped us with, which we appreciate greatly. I'll just touch on this quickly, and I'm going to weave this in with some acknowledgements on my own. I will say thank you very much to the CT policing team. There was many of them, but Will, of course, spent a great deal of time leading this, as Neil mentions, over the last 18 months. Also with the interviews, my fellow team member, Claudia, was very helpful, and our comms team as well, Jack from our comms team. So we did 21 structured interviews, and that included reporters and editors. Like I said, it also included, I say professional media representatives for a lack of better term, but organizations like the Society of Editors and IPSO, and we the Editors Code of Practice Committee. So that's what I mean by that. The Counterterrorism Communications Desk. So we spoke with CT Policing Communications Desk and Home Office counterterrorism desks. And then we also spoke to university academics, people who were from journalism programs, policing programs, and terrorism studies programs, to try and get some varied perspective on on sort of the practical dynamics and factors that impact how the media reports and the role that they can play in terrorism. So we sort of determined it with this paper, we focused on three main actors as part of that role. We call them public, the police, and the media. And I recognize right now that that's quite simplified. We only had so many words to go at this within the paper. And there are some actors that we didn't get to. So there are malicious actors as well that we didn't have the scope to cover in this paper. But as far as what we meant by the public does impact the way that the media report on terrorism and the way that the police issue communications or the Home Office might issue communications on terrorism. So I think we need to recognize that the impact that they play, the role of, the increased amount of journalism that the public do themselves by posting pictures and videos in an active, environment online, as well as, sort of citizen journalism and various alt media sites and their impact on this process. I think the police also do play a role, and I make a point about this in the impact of media reporting, because they are sort of they hold the official information in an active terrorist incidents. They are the ones to be able to issue that information. And in the face of that not being available, then the media have to proceed with the information that they have available to them. So the police do play a role. And of course, the police do play a role with their own communications as well, and the things that they have to consider with how they use their own language and framing, and the limitations of that in describing different types of violence that may not be as easy to label as terrorist events. And then the media, of course, they have a role as well. And that I'm going to explore a little bit more on the next slide. So we'll come back to that in a little more detail. We did ask this question about responsibility of impact, and I really got a very interesting array of answers to that question. Certainly, we emphasize with this report that the freedom of expression needs to be protected, that the media plays a very important role in public information and being a source of that information. But certainly, I think, we did sort of in the end coalesce around a majority that do recognize that the media does have some responsibility for the social impacts of its reporting, and as well as the police have responsibility for the impacts of their communications. So I'll go on real quickly to the dynamics and factors, I think, contributing. And this was a big part of the report. This was sort of where we asked questions about the day-to-day challenges that are faced at a news desk when you're reporting on this issue. And certainly the online information ecosystem was often raised as one of the big factors. And this paper doesn't address the social media realm, but it does address sort of how that impacts a news desk reporter's, ability to report, and the challenges it might present with the plethora of unverified information that is available online, and how to sort that and use that in a fashion that is responsible and timely, and under all the pressures that you're facing to get a news story out in a quick fashion after an event. This also factors into the need for speed and sort of the changing space, I think, for news organizations, and that most of them or all of them are moving to at least some online content, if not all online content. There's no longer a sort of 5 o'clock deadline for getting your story in. It's happening right now, and you have to be quick about the way that you respond to things in order to get traffic to that coverage, which adds, doubles the sort of the challenges of doing this in a quick way, and perhaps presents, where it can be helpful to have some easy reference, non-prescriptive guidance to just sort of look to as you're working quickly on a story and trying to get it right and remember the impacts that it might have. And then we looked at language and framing quite closely. And this is where we brought in the data that UCL, Paul and Bennett were able to give us from the language analysis, and sort of cross-referenced it with the questions that we asked in the interviews in order to really get a look at some of these issues of whether, there has been a change over time in the way that terrorism is reported on. And we really found over the last 20 years, there hasn't been a great change. Certainly the nature of terrorism is always changing, and the terrorist organizations that might be at the top of everyone's mind are changing, but the sort of overall sentiment of that terrorism reporting hasn't necessarily changed greatly over that length of time. And we did find, that the political leaning of papers or the ideological differences between terrorist actors, they can play a role, and they sometimes do play a role. And I, asked everyone sort of about their perspectives on whether reporting was different if you were talking about an Islamist-inspired attacker versus a far-right inspired attacker, and how those differences might be represented if there are differences. So we do address these questions in the reporting, and sort of the challenges that are represented by those questions. The demographic identifiers sort of, it came up, pretty much everyone agreed that there is a need to represent demographic identifiers such as ethnicity or background, but that this, I think the majority felt that this was dealt with pretty fairly. So one of the things, the next section of the paper that we come to was sort of this issue of guidance and whether there is, or what is the value of additional guidance. And I zoned in on 4 topics where I thought that I do think there is some additional value in having some non-prescriptive guidance around these issues. Just to remind everyone as we're working forward on these issues of the potential impacts that could be had here. Obviously, not all impact is going to be felt the same way, on a different day. So there is an amount of perspective that's needed with that. But volume being one of the entire media space and the 24-hour news cycle, this is a very challenging one to address, but one certainly I think that should remain at the forefront of discussion. How much terrorism reporting is happening can increase public fear of terrorism happening. Content, under this I covered issues like framing and bias and language usage and usage of images, which I think the image one has certainly come to a different point with digital reporting now, and how that might change the way images appear in stories and where they appear. Under sensitivity, this one is covered under the code, and so I'm not reinventing the wheel on this. It was just represented to me across most of the interviews as an issue that is particularly challenging to interpret and can be discussed further, I think, and sort of training around that further. And then impact, and these were some of the ones that sort of arose partially from that first paper and the look at the theoretical base. But this is around sort of disinformation and speculation and the sort of potential amplification of that or of propaganda materials, and how that can sometimes contribute to imitation. So there are some practical examples of potential guidance lines that are presented in the paper under these topics. And then we come to the information relationship with the police. And I will say that this sort of arose out of that question about the online information ecosystem because of the way that the police hold that first bit of verified information. It really emerged that it's necessary to have a good working relationship with the police. And I think, as Neil mentioned in his opening, this has been damaged over the last years due to, I think, many different factors. And I think there is areas where it can be improved. So I sort of came to 4 suggested areas where I think it could be improved, and gave some suggestions under these on potentially how that could happen. Recognition being one of them, sort of recognizing that each of you has, the media and the police have different concerns, different purposes for what you do and how you do it and when you do it. The sharing of information more widely, I think, is important. And doing that obviously in a responsible way. Communication, open lines of communication being available, and avenues for training to occur, and for ideas and perspectives to be exchanged. And then the education points, and this is about sort of proactive briefings and reactive briefings, and how can we learn lessons from what has happened and use those going forwards. So I'm probably running out of time here to go through all of these specifically. These are the final project recommendations, and these sort of build off of what I was just saying, some very specific about the briefings. One of them being that the police could join the Defense and Security Media Advisory Committee. This has been for national security matters and operational concerns, this has been a positive method that was identified to me as a way to spread information to the media. And then to provide evidence of impacts and to establish their own internal communications guidance was a suggestion that I made to policing and government communications. And then for the media, I mean, I just encouraged internal written guidance. I often heard sort of the editors know what they want. They know, they know the code, they know it themselves, and they discuss it, but it's often not written down. And I think as we all hope that terrorism events happen less frequently, that might, present some concerns as young journalists come in, that the information is being disseminated in a clear and easily accessible way. Also, to conduct regular internal trainings or engagement sessions on these issues. I heard a lot about trainings often happen around fraud and other issues, but often not as much on the ethics code or potential impact of terrorism reporting, and then sort of engaging in a cross-industry discussion of the guidance recommendations and these categories that were identified as particularly challenging around terrorism reporting, I think is important. And I wrap up for the media with a point about, I think adding a terrorism guidance page to the IPSO website might be a very convenient sort of place to put it, as in there are other guidance pages there that give non-prescriptive reference to different issues such as suicide, or even COVID's on there now, in the same way, to just offer an easily accessible page of guidance points. So that is a very quick overview, and I apologize if I spoke too quickly, but I'll go back to you, Liz, for now.
Thanks very much, Jess. That was completely comprehensive. Thank you very much indeed. And we've got questions coming in on that already, so keep them coming. We're going to move now to speak to and hear from Ian Murray of the Society of Editors. I mentioned earlier, the aim of this is to protect the freedoms of the news media. It's an organisation with almost 400 members, and they're in a variety of different roles. They come in newspapers, they work in magazines, radio, television, digital media, also includes media lawyers and media academics. Ian became the executive director of the Society of Editors in 2017, and before this he was the editor of the Southern Daily Echo, and he was the editor-in-chief of NewsQuest's Hampshire titles, and he was in that role for some 20 years. He was also the president of the Society of Editors between 2013 and 2014. He's been a member of the Society since its very formation in 1999. Ian was also appointed the vice chair of the Defence and Security Media Advisory Committee in 2018. So Ian, if I could please now hand over to you for 10 minutes of your reflections. Thank you.
I've unmuted myself. Getting used to the technology. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you very much indeed for that, for bigging me up in that way. It was very kind of you. May I say at the outset, I'm delighted to be given the opportunity to speak at today's launch of this report, and from the outset to say that I cannot, and I'm sure you will understand why I say this, I cannot speak on behalf of the wonderful plurality of the UK media. No one can do that, which is, of course, both the joy and the challenge of a media such as ours in a free, democratic, liberal society. And I suppose one of the great challenges in a free society is how do you keep it free? How do you square the circle? How do you actually allow freedom of expression, allow free speech, and how do you protect those when they most come under attack? And it is offset by lots of people, politicians, of course, that yes, they completely value having a free press and recognise the need for a free press and to defend a free press as one of the great pillars that protects our society. And then, of course, it comes under pressure for something like covering terrorism, and suddenly it's well, we want it to be responsible. And what, of course, is one person's responsible coverage of a terror outrage or some other incident or some news story is another person's salacious coverage, over-the-top coverage. And it's tackling those kind of issues. Now, when the proposal for this report first came up, I was grateful on behalf of the Society of Editors, and I know a lot of other representatives of the media were grateful to be involved in this, at the very least, to be able to put the point of view that were there, and to hammer home that message that a free press in covering terror is absolutely vital. And I'm delighted to say that we've had the ability to do that. I'd be wrong if I didn't say there was some trepidation about what the final report was going to say. You know, is this going to be, for all the difficult points that you've raised there, is it going to be an attempt to, I'll use the word emasculate or dictate to the press, if you should do this, you shouldn't do that. That has not been the case. And as the discussions have gone on, first paper and then the second paper, that became obvious that this wasn't to get the press. This wasn't that. This was a very pragmatic approach to this and wanting to listen. And whereas, of course, you're not all going to agree with every single element that's come there, that is brought out, I think there will be agreement that our voice has been heard. And I'm very much heartened, and I believe a lot of my colleagues, if not most, will be, by the fact that the report underscores the importance of the role that free media plays in society, and in particular, in this case, of course, covering terror. Now, we've not been afraid of having this discussion. And 4 years ago, at my first conference that I staged for the Society of Editors in Cambridge, when I first took over as Chief Executive Director, we actually had a panel that discussed at that conference, are we doing the terrorist job for them? So there has been a willingness, and that wasn't the first time, willingness to have a debate and discussion about all this, and to listen, and to continue that debate and discussion. Mr. Basu's comments brought it to the fore, and I was delighted when he accepted my invitation to come and speak at our conference, and to speak more on those matters, because it is through engagement, it is through these two pillars, well, not the only pillars, of what protects a free democratic society, coming together as much as we can. We'll never be hand in glove, of course not. Of course we can't do that. But coming together and trying to understand each other. And once again, it's absolutely correct, as has been pointed out, there has been a diverging of that. It's purely to do with following the Leveson inquiry, or there were other elements that are involved with that was there. And I'm heartened by the fact, and I know others will be, by the fact that one of the themes through this report are to repair some of the damage, if I can go so far, that's there in those relationships, and bring this back around the table to actually discuss. Because ultimately, the worst thing that could possibly happen is, and one of the shall we say, goals of the terrorists is to actually drive those pillars of democracy and society apart, to have us at each other's throats and not listening to each other, and retreating to camps, and slinging mud and worse at each other. And this, the report makes that perfectly plain. Because one of the greatest challenges in a free and liberal society is creating that balance between the public's right to know and what is being done in their name, and ensuring they remain protected from those who would wish to harm them. And we would say that that's as vital to the police, that the public actually have trust in what is being done in their name to secure them, and that that nothing is being covered up and nothing is being done. And as has been mentioned, I sit as the joint vice chair of the Defence and Security Media Advisory Committee, otherwise known as the D-Notice, erroneously as the D-Notice Committee. And I'm not revealing any secrets when I say that, yes, there is a steady flow of requests from the public to that, to say, is it true that the D-Notice has been issued by the government to suppress this, to suppress that? And of course, that's a complete misunderstanding of what it's there for. But I say that just to show just how easy it is for the public, or some sections of the public, to mistrust what is going on and being done in their name. And the more transparent that can be, the better. Now, of course, where does that balance come? How do we police with a small p tolerance? How do we police this? And how, in this case, do we get that balance right of keeping the public informed, ensuring that the media can do their job, but not aiding the terrorists in that work? And I believe that this paper reveals a pragmatic piece of research, which concludes, of course, the media's role in covering terrorism subjects is vital, plays an important function in keeping the public informed and therefore safer. But it concludes there is work to be done on both sides, both the police and the media, which if achieved could bring a fuller understanding of the aims and challenges faced when tackling terrorism-related subjects. It recommends, as Jess has gone over, looking at those topics, education, communication, information, and recognition, all the shuns that are there. That's recognition that we both have important roles to play, that neither is the enemy, the other side, the enemy are the terrorists that are there, and that it's through that education, understanding, both sides understanding how the other one works, what this basically means, communication, and the relationship that's there, and the information we put out there, and talking and understanding in that way. And I would hope that the majority of my colleagues, if not all of my colleagues in the industry, will look at that and say that that is a good way forward. We're not going to give up the right to decide how we can cover in a free society a terrorist attack. We want to listen and we want to understand. And again, picking up what Jess was saying in the report, advice, guidelines, but not prescriptive there. There has to be that understanding that those decisions can be made in newsrooms, and there will be a varying degree as to how that will be presented. Nothing will be perfect. We will continue to move forward. The public's impression and understanding of what they want, what they consider to be responsible journalism, will continue to evolve. And believe you me, media will not survive in whatever form it is if they do not take that into account. And so are just as keen to understand with that, to have this conversation, I believe. And I think I'll just finish by saying that, with as I say in my introduction to the report, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that, that with a better understanding of the ways in which these essential aims of our free society, the police arms of our free society, the police and the media cooperate, we can work together to combat those who threaten us without diminishing our respective roles. So thank you for the chance to be involved and to be involved in today.
Thanks very much, Ian. Definite emphasis on collaboration in both the report and everything that you've been saying as well. We have one final speaker left for this afternoon's event, and that is Charlotte Dewar. She's the Chief Executive of the Independent Press Standards Organisation, or IPSO. IPSO is the independent regulator for a large majority of newspapers and magazines in this country, and they hold newspapers and magazines to account whilst protecting individual rights, upholding high standards of journalism, and maintaining freedom of expression for the press. Before leading IPSO, Charlotte was IPSO's Director of Operations, where she was managing complaints, standards, systems, and their arbitration scheme. And before that, she worked as the Director of Complaints and Pre-Publication Services at the Press Complaints Commission. She's also been in the office of the Independent Readers Editor at The Guardian. So she's very qualified to join us today with her thoughts. So I'll hand over to you now. Charlotte, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liz. So first of all, just to say that IPSO absolutely welcomes this report, and thank you very much to Dr. White, to Jess, for the hard work and thought that you've put into this. I think, speaking as someone who did participate in the research, both the process and then also the final report really speak eloquently to the value of collaboration and discussion, particularly given that this, as the very apt title puts it, this is a very complex area. But even though it is a complex area, I think it's definitely not one that we can afford to or should file away in the box of things that are just sort of too difficult. Because for one thing, we all have a direct personal shared interest in limiting the potential for news coverage to amplify terrorist propaganda. And that, of course, that's only one aspect of this report, but I think it's a critically important one. And then the second is, yes, there are areas where there are likely to be disagreement. There's likely to be disagreement about individual editorial calls or kind of how to weigh the different competing interests. But there are a lot of areas where I think positive change can be made. And if editors are aware of kind of the particular impact of particular choices, they are in a better position to make the right, or, to make the best possible call for them with full information. So, the issues in the report are a lot wider than what is specifically in the editor's code. And I think Jess did quite a good job of kind of being clear about, some things are very much editor's code issues, some things are broader. But I think IPSO does have, and the editor's code has an essential role to play at the core of this, particularly for regulated titles, but also kind of more generally in the conversation. And I was also glad to see that the report reflects some of the ways in which IPSO's services and functions have an impact, and thinking here specifically about the guidance we've issued previously on major incidents, which I think is something we sort of potentially look to build on or to have be part of training and guidance going forward. And then also the privacy notice system. We've been working very hard over the last year to improve awareness of that system, particularly among emergency responders in the aftermath of major incidents. But I think there is more work to be done there, and we are going to be continuing on with that. I know there's a particular interest on the sort of guidance going forward. I think the context is incredibly important. So, the media, regulated titles and kind of other mainstream media are reporting on these incidents in the context of social media. And with some of these issues are incredibly tricky, and volume is absolutely one that come to mind. I'm sure I'm not the only person who has found themselves the minute that that a terror incident is happening or may be happening, what are you doing? You are immediately reloading every single news page of every single news source, social media, mainstream media, because you want to find out what's happening. And that's particularly true if the attack is happening in the city in which you live, which sadly, I have had that experience, and I'm sure many of us have had that in this room. So, any recommendations or guidance going forward needs to take account the interests of readers in having rapid, accurate understanding of what's unfolding, and the fact that readers will go to social media if they are not getting news from regulated titles. But that's not a reason to kind of throw up your hands. I think that makes it all the more important that titles are able to say, as Jess makes the point, that they are doing something that's incredibly valuable and important in those moments. They do have the expertise and the experience and the awareness to deliver news quickly as readers want it, but in the right way so that readers can actually trust what they are reading and kind of feel that it's dealt with sensitively and appropriately. So I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation, but the issues that Jess is highlighting are absolutely the right ones. And we are looking forward to kind of being part of an ongoing discussion about how to take this forward.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. Unless you've got anything else to contribute, I think we're going to have a couple of questions for you and for Ian before we move to the Q&A. And thank you to all of the presenters for bringing such a range of perspectives to the table here. So I'm going to return to a slide that Jess showed as part of her presentation, where she talked about guidance, and she mentioned 4 things: volume, content, sensitivity, and also impact. Content talking about framing and bias, language, imagery, and impact talking about things such as disinformation and speculation. And I wondered, could go to Charlotte first perhaps, and then to Ian. Could you give your thoughts on the guidance relating to these things: volume, content, sensitivities, and impact? Thanks, Charlotte.
Yeah, I think I'll kind of take them in opposite order. I think they're 4 kind of really important but quite different issues raised, really. I think the material that Jess has kind of grouped together under impact, I think is very, very interesting, because it really represents the possibility of editors and journalists having new information about how what they are doing is going. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, everybody. My computer is just, this is really terrible timing. I'm running out of battery. So could we just go to Ian and you can come back to me?
Ian, do jump in.
There we go. I keep forgetting I have to unmute in that kind of sense. So that's a shame, Charlotte. I was going to crib your answers and just follow on and say Charlotte's answered everything for me. Oh,
sorry, I actually just solved my problem very quickly, so I can actually. That's appalling technical. I can, if you would like, I can actually carry on.
Carry on. I can crib your answers.
Okay, I will do that. So yeah, so I think, you know, the impact stuff is really interesting, and I know Samaritans are obviously a very well recognized organization for having engaged with the media to change coverage in their area of interest, and I think there's a really interesting read across here, and a very specific one actually, around the issue of imitation. And you know, Samaritans, of course, editors don't always make decisions based on kind of Samaritans' request or Samaritans' guidance, but Samaritans have been able to equip editors with new information about how their coverage may be affecting the kind of broader climate. And I think that's a really interesting and important area. In terms of sensitivity, as Jess says, this is an area that is covered by the editor's code. It is very, very difficult. And I think it's also an area where it changes over time, kind of reader expectations about what coverage is going to be appropriate, especially around the use of photography. Sort of new issues come up all the time. And I think in terms of, you know, a particular area here is coverage, photographs of perpetrators of terror attacks. And I think this is something that I personally wasn't hearing about, you know, even 3 or 4 years ago at all. This was not something that was on my radar, but now I think the public are, you know, editors are aware of it and the public are aware of it. And I think I see changes being made. Now, I don't think that's necessarily an issue under the editor's code, but I think it's increasingly something that editors are aware of. And I think that's a benefit. Finally, content, you know, this is a very, very complex area. And I think there's a very interesting and challenging discussion to be had about the framing around different types of terrorism. You know, far-right terrorism, Islamist terrorism, these are really challenging issues. I think there's a much broader discussion to be had. I know there is other research has been done on it. The Center for Media Monitoring has done interesting looking at sort of comparatively at this. So I think that's very much something that is worth carrying on the conversation about. And then finally, I did talk a little bit about volume previously. I think this is the most difficult area, first of all, because of the public appetite for and kind of the critical importance of the public understanding what is going on, wanting to understand how incidents like this can happen, and also the fact that it's not a problem that any individual editor or journalist has it in their gift to solve. Sort of, there is a collective action problem. If you don't publish one story, all that happens is readers are not going to be reading about that news on your site. It's hard to see how that individual action helps. So I think that may be the most difficult area to make progress on.
Thanks, Charlotte. Over to you then, Ian, if you're ready for ready.
Thanks very much. And as I suspected, Charlotte's covered a lot of the areas that I was going to say. And I might do it in the other order, because the first one I was going to pick up was volume. And anyone who's worked in the media industry will know the pressures that there are to get the story and to get the story first. And I suppose when I was in my newspaper days, it was, well, you only do that, Mr. Murray, to sell newspapers. Well, that's exactly what it is, commercial things. But I'm not trying to make out that newspaper editors are so crass as to just have that one thing, that one point in mind. But there are all kinds of reasons why, when an incident takes place, and whether it happens to be a terror incident or whether it happens to be a rail crash or something like that, a big incident takes place, there is going to be an awful lot of news and information that's there. And picking up on what Charlotte said beforehand, this has become even more important that this actually happens, that the trusted media, shall we say, and I've used that word trusted, the most trusted media, the mainstream media, with our practices of edited news, of training, of adhering to regulators and to codes, and whether that be IPSO, whether it be Ofcom, whether it be the others that are there. These are the best way to get that trusted news out there. And if you don't put it out there, and if you don't continue to put the latest information, then nature, and so do human beings, abhors a vacuum. And human beings will look around for anything else that they can find, and it's fitting around on social media and all manner of things there. So this is the biggest challenge, but it doesn't mean that it isn't something that can't be considered. And because there are so many players, and remember, not just in this country, the way that the world is today, that it's going to be the international press that are covering it. You're going to have live coverage on American news channels and other English-speaking news channels and elsewhere of events that are taking place in London, where there's an awful lot of the world's press are gathered, in the same way as terror attack in Paris or New York is covered in the, or Christchurch, New Zealand is covered in the same sort of way. And to expect the British media to hold off and to not be bringing the latest, and some of that is going to be speculation because it's rolling news channels, is, I'm not going to use the word naive, but it's difficult. But that doesn't mean that there can't be discussions about this. And that doesn't mean, and the British media has made great strides. It has made great strides in these discussions. It's not the free-for-all that perhaps it's painted that's there, but there are the challenges, and the discussions can still be had, particularly in how terror incidents and the whole subject of terrorist can be covered in less heat of the moment, shall we say, but also about the content, about the language that's being used, about whether this is far right attack, is that terrorism or Islamic terrorism, or what, all those kind of things that can be used, that even in the heat of covering something can be taken into account. Now, I'm not going to say here that I'm speaking on behalf of the whole of the media that this is what they should do and this is what they shouldn't do, but the conversation is what's important. And without that, and what we're referring back to the report, without that communication, education, conversation between, then that information isn't going to be there. That isn't going to be. No. And one of the, and Charlotte alluded to it, mentioned it there has been a change. There is the discussion about where do you put the picture? Do you show the photographs of the terrorists? Do you particularly if they've died, do you give them that glory that they wanted? Do you put them all over the front page? Most definitely. Do you put their photograph next to the photograph of their victims? And these were discussions that were not taking place a while ago, and now they are uppermost in their mind. And I remember going back to the dreadful attack of the Manchester Arena bombing, and the Manchester Evening News and probably other news outlets, but definitely the Manchester Evening News, said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to put the terrorist image on the front page. We're not going to put with next to the victims in that way. That's not what we want for our community here. So the conversation is continuing to go on. And it, as has been mentioned, I truly believe it's not a prescriptive, it's you must not do this, you can't do this. It's education, it's discussion. This is where society is moving to. And yes, maybe the media will actually be ahead of society and be moving the dial a bit before it in that way.
Thanks very much, Ian, also for sort of flagging the positives that the media are doing, and this really sort of, the organic evolution in some cases of media policy on really complex area of terrorism, and for Charlotte for really emphasising that, the media is not one thing. There's many different organisations and, doing different things, even if there are some shared themes which Jess highlighted. We're going to move to questions now for everyone. I'm going to direct questions to individuals as we've got half an hour now, thereabouts, for the questions. But if you want to kind of come in and I didn't put the question to you, then just raise your hand, put your mic on. It's good to have a conversation, so don't be shy about kind of butting in some way. I'm going to actually put the first question to Neil based on his comments earlier. And Neil, you mentioned that the police are making changes and seeking and rebuilding trust actively. And I wondered if you might just outline what those changes are and how that trust is being rebuilt.
Of course, thanks, Liz. The most important thing, I think Ian has said it very well, is to actually be having a conversation. And that conversation we should be having, it's a bit ironic given the meeting that we're in, but those conversations should first be had in private. There should be a kind of an educational process between us and the media. And I think it's really important, and particularly for those members of the media who are signed into this webinar, is understanding where the police come from in this, because part of it is, let's be frank, an over-emotional reaction to the fact that, every single one of the 12 attacks that's happened in this country are still in the crime scene. And I've met lots of victims and survivors of terrorism, and some of their comments about how they have been treated by some members of the press do stay with you. But I've never been the type of person to condemn an entire profession for the actions of one person. There are, I think, Ian, you described it, a whole panoply, a plethora of journalistic sources, including some of whom are freelancers, citizen journalists, don't have any credentials whatsoever, who can commit some of the most egregious and insensitive acts. The trouble is that has, I think, in the past rubbed off on us, and we've seen that, and we've made the same mistake we asked the media not to do for my profession, which is tar us all with the same brush. So the first thing is to start back at the beginning and say, is there a sensible relationship here that we can have between us? And for us as policing, the first, and this is part of the recommendations, is to have this webinar and have this conversation with the media, is to say we fully accept that one of the absolute cornerstones of the liberal democracy we're all very fortunate to live in is a free press that gets not just to hold the terrorists to account, so actually to say what they believe is horrific acts by those people, but to hold the national security community and policing to account for what they are doing in the public's name to keep them safe. I think that's almost exactly what you said, Ian, and you're absolutely right. We shouldn't be allowed to do whatever we like, otherwise we wouldn't be living in a liberal democracy. And actually, most of the agents and police officers I deal with, they believe that to their core. I think it was David Anderson who told me when he was reviewing our own inspection of ourselves post the 2017 attacks, you can be too proportionate, Neil, I mean, it's almost a bumper sticker. I've spent, since the Human Rights Act in 1998, it being ploughed into the police officers that they should be proportionate, legal, accountable, and necessary in the actions that they take on behalf of the public. We feel like that, but you have a pivotal role in holding us to account for that. Some of the things that we've talked about, have opened our eyes into how media is reporting, but some things we've talked about the speed. So we have to recognize that we hold the cards in the early days of an incident. And this thing about allowing a vacuum to develop and then complaining because that vacuum is then filled is ludicrous. We shouldn't be in that space. We should be filling it with professional reporting, getting onto the right channels with the most trusted media and giving them the facts as early as possible. It was Mark Rodley who taught me that. Thank you, Mark. And Mark was out there quickly, and we changed the whole way that we reported and started using social media ourselves to make sure that we got some accurate, swift reporting out there to try and close down speculation. So we need to keep learning those lessons in the same way that we're asking the media to keep learning lessons as new journalists come on board. We have new members of policing coming on board, new members of the security community, some of them who are much more au fait with social media and much cleverer in the way that they use it and much quicker in the way that they use it, which can help fill some of that gap. But all I'd say, the mainstream media and the people we're talking about at the moment have got a massive responsibility. And I'm pleased Ian mentioned the Manchester Evening News, whose circulation went up when they decided not to do some of the things that perhaps ordinarily we would expect the public want. So there is a more complex argument here about, is it really what the public want? And I'm never going to, so one of the things I'm going to say is I do need you to report terrorism. I really need you to do it. But I need you to major on the victims, the survivors, the heroism. I need you to major on, the information the public needs to keep them safe should it happen again. The information they need to take some control. And I'm not asking people not to report on the terrorist. I'm just asking it not to be a scrolling image that goes out 24/7 for the next multiple days. And that I think is, the conversation that we need to have about the best way we can do this. Not, God forbid, anyone would have thought that we were trying to say, you mustn't do it. I think one of the critical roles of a free press in a liberal democracy, I would hope, and most of the responsible journalists and the crime and security correspondents we deal with, is to recognize there is a responsibility to maintain community cohesion there as well. And there's some questions on there about the language we use, when we use it against what types of terrorism. We need to be starting to have that conversation so we understand what we're doing to maintain cohesion, because that is really doing the terrorist job. Sorry to go on.
Sorry, Neil. No, it's really important. It's really important that you answer that. I want to give a question to Jess, but first, briefly, there's a question relating to the sensible relationship you just talked about, Neil, between police and media. A question to Ian from one of our guests, Rizwana Hamid. Concern here about journalists taking the lead from the police. Ian, is this about journalists taking the lead from the police, this conversation?
I mean, if I interpret the question, I'm not quite sure what the question means. Does it mean, I can answer it, and I'll try from perhaps different aspects. Does it mean that, is this about journalists just Klein and Sinker accepting what the police say and not asking any other questions? If communications is better, well, the answer for that would be no. That would never be like that. But obviously, as we mentioned beforehand, this vacuum of information that's there will lead to speculation, not just in the media. Is it about the journalists not doing their job if the police will just provide them with information? Then I think the answer is no, not to that. But I think the more information that flows, the more communication that there is. And look, I'm not saying newspapers, but the whole of the media understands that information that has to come out, and we want it to be accurate. We want it to be accurate, and we'd be the first ones to leap up and down if inaccurate information is actually put out there. So I think again that comes down to that education and understanding each other. From the police's point of view, probably understanding how the media works and the kind of pressures that's there, and also for news editors, and reporters and everything to know, well, look, this is the reason why we haven't got this information for you yet. We're not stalling or something on those kind of things. And we're all used to over coverage in the United States if something takes place, and the police chief is immediately there handing over body camera footage and that, whereas for all reasons that doesn't happen here. So I'm not quite sure what the question is, but if it's a case of do we just want the police and we'll just sit there waiting and the police will give us the line and then that's it, thank you very much. And I'm sure that's not what the report is saying, but I hope I haven't misinterpreted the question.
I thought the question was about sort of tail wagging the dog, but Neil, I know you want to come in here.
Yeah, that's how I interpreted the question. I wouldn't want the media to do that, not in my country. The thing that makes great journalists and great police officers in the past such close friends is that we both do the same job. We both want to get the truth and the accurate story and the investigation. And we want those facts to be given. But the only time I would want the media to be taking a lead from the police is if we were telling you that by publishing the story and the facts and the great story you've uncovered at this point in time, you are going to cause great harm to an investigation or potentially put lives at threat. Then I would want them to follow the lead of the police. And just to big up the press, in 2017, because Mark and I and other CT professionals did quite a lot of work post the 2015 attacks in actually asking the press to understand that, we had some great cooperation when we had operations to conduct where the press actually had information and they withheld the reporting of it until we had concluded the operation. That is the only situation I can think of, is if it was going to cause harm. And of course, the only reason that Ian's members are going to believe me is if they've already formed a trusted relationship with me, which means let's go back to the start. Let's try and form that trusted relationship, build the social capital before the critical incident happens.
It is that matter of trust, and you're giving away no secrets of the trade in that. So the conversations take place between journalists, between newsrooms, and not just the police, but other organisations where it's can we just tell you about this? These will be the consequences if and da 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 da. You've got to be able to trust each other to have those conversations. There has to be an understanding that, well, still going to be down to our judgment as to whether we go ahead or not, but we can see that's there. And if that trust is broken on either side, that we feel that we were sold a pup on that's not the case, and we've been abused, that trust will simply break down. But as you say, in recent years, but probably you can go back probably a decade or more, it's been going we've been going in, if not opposite directions, then certainly tram tracks down there, with a risk of we'll end up going in opposite directions and ending up in completely different camps. And yeah, communication is the key, and getting that trust in place.
Thank you both. I'm going to move to another question now. We've got a lot of questions coming in, and I apologise if we don't have time to sort of get to all of them. But we have got a question for Jess, I think, which is about labels, and it's about demographics. So the question is about consistency in reporting, and it's about communities, I think. So we've got a comment from Rizwana Hamid again, who is talking about the obvious kind of bias that has been seen and perceived by a lot of Muslim communities around the reporting of terrorism, relating to Islamist terrorism, relating to groups like Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and the effects that that has had for Muslim communities. So how do we ensure that damage to Muslim communities isn't perpetuated? How do we include Muslim communities in conversations? How does that best happen? If I can start with Jess here.
Yeah, I mean, it's very challenging to cover the contents of this paper in 10 minutes and to sort of bring out the nuance of these conversations, because I had 21 very interesting conversations that all included this subject, because no matter if it was the academics or the communications desk, you know, police or whatever, or the media, the reporters and the editors, everyone has to deal with this issue of what words do you use to describe these instances and how do you keep that fair? And I think, you know, there are issues around legal definitions of terrorism and scale of attack, and these things factor into how we describe what you know may or may not be an act of terrorism and how you define that. And the language analysis did show that the word terrorism is used more in relation to acts of Islamist inspired terrorism in media reporting than it is to right-wing inspired terrorism. And I mean, I think that that is partly due to a framing issue that has happened over the last 20 years. But it's also due to this difficulty in describing, you know, small acts of violence as terrorism if the person isn't clearly linked to a terrorist organization in the way that might be easy to identify with something like an Islamic State flag or whatever it might be. So I mean, there are challenges to be considered, but it certainly was part of the recommendations and sort of the non-prescriptive guidance, you know, that I laid out that journalists, I think, do need to examine their own, whether it's conscious or subconscious, you know, bias on the subject. Everyone has an opinion, everyone has a point of view, and just to sit down in a room full of other reporters and editors that also deal with this subject and sort of self-examine your perspective. I think these types of exercises and sort of engagement across the field of players would help just to reconsider what your own perspective might be when you are reporting on these issues, and how that might influence the story that comes out and the frame that it's put into.
Thank you very much, Jess, for dealing with that question. It's really, really important, particularly as we know the far right is a rising sort of challenge, and we're going to have the same issues, or some of the same issues, challenges around disparities in reporting that, you know, some have been identified already. I want to go to Charlotte for the next question. We have discussed the pressures of a newsroom when a big story is breaking, when a terrorist attack is happening. There's a number of questions which are about that live situation, that being first, and there's questions about being live, about the use of sources, which sources count, and also the use of images. So if I could go to Charlotte about how best to ensure that in a breaking news situation, when we've got competing interests, when we've got global news outlets doing all sorts of things that particular British outlets would not do, unverified reports, what are journalists, what should they be doing? Where should they be going? Where can they get that information? How do we ensure that that happens?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very conscious in answering this question that my last experience in a newsroom was over 10 years ago. And I wasn't just someone who was reporting breaking news then either. I was working in the reader's editor's office, which very much was one very firm step removed from that. So I do approach this question with a certain humility, but it's absolutely true that I have a lot of secondhand kind of knowledge of it, albeit knowledge that's largely derived through complaints where something has gone wrong. And I think that it's a really important point to make, that we've all know instances in which gathering material from social media, for example, about a live about a live incident, ongoing incident has gone wrong. But I think much less notable are the countless, the overwhelmingly large number of instances in which journalists have worked really quickly and effectively to understand a breaking news situation by using an excellent source of information, which is live witness accounts from people who are seeing it and who are publishing photos of it to show what they're seeing and talking in ways that journalists are able to verify, or at least take some steps to verify, by looking at kind of the location and the types of material in different accounts and making sure they correlate. I think we had an interesting example of that a few years ago with the Manchester Arena attack. There was sadly a really awful instance, and this gets back to Jess's point about kind of bad actors, in which someone was published a hoax information claiming that a person who was missing in the attack, they published was their sister. We don't know who this person was. They published a photograph. The photograph was of a girl who was not near the arena at the time and had no involvement whatsoever, but she did live in the area, so it was plausible that she was involved. Unfortunately, that was published as a kind of currently believed to be missing photograph in the Daily Star. And the Star apologized very fully the next day. The mother of the child did end up making a complaint to IPSO, which was upheld as a breach of the child's privacy. It was a very unfortunate situation. But what was very notable about it was that other journalists were well aware of this and had been successful in detecting, that there was some doubt about this and had not published the information. And I think that's the area. It's an example just of one of many where I think there are a lot of skills being brought to bear on this. There's a lot of experience being brought to bear on this and sort of keeping up with bad actors, but also kind of non-malicious reasons why there can be confusion, and actually filtering information to make sure it's accurate, and then also to make sure the status. So if you're not sure whether it's accurate, but you believe it's credible, making that clear to readers as well, so they can come to their own judgments. So, I'm not someone who can speak to, a direct experience in how that's done, but I do think there's a valuable conversation to be had of kind of sharing best practice, and newsrooms talking to each other and talking to police and to others who have information about those techniques, and kind of how to work together to kind of ensure that everybody has the best chance of reporting responsibly and accurately, especially when timelines are very, very short.
Thanks, Sean.
Elizabeth, if I can just come in from that with regards to the newsroom. Yes, the hurly-burly, the heat of the moment, news coming in from all over the place, picking up from all kinds of social media, all kinds of things like that, and lots of decisions being made. But underscoring it all is no editor, no journalist wants to get it wrong. They don't want that for professional pride, for sheer embarrassment, being hauled over the coals by their editor, being hauled over the coals by IPSO, and it is a big threat. And just I can speak for no journalist wants to deliberately bring extra heartache to families, to victims' families, to loved ones, and those kind of things. They simply don't want to do that. Yes, errors take place, and everything that can be done to reduce those errors and misinformation, disinformation, because editors will know, and look, every time we get it wrong, that weakens our credibility, our credentials for being the trusted media. So it is taken very, very seriously. It's not a Wild West out there, as I said beforehand, and a lot of thinking goes on. Errors are going to happen, and quite rightfully, Mr. Bazoo was saying beforehand that we should hold, the media should hold the police to account and to high standards, and quite rightfully so. That the media should be as well, and believe you me, when circumstances like this happen, when an error happens, when the wrong thing is done, there is an awful lot of soul searching and a lot of tough words being said, and steps of how can we ensure this doesn't happen going forward.
I'm going to use that opportunity then to talk about Leveson, which we've got a question for Neil, and I know you just raised your hand, Neil. Lord Carlisle's got this question, which is about, the aftermath of things going wrong. Leveson called for records to be kept of meetings between senior police officers and the media. Police whistleblowers concerned about malpractice within the service not to go to the media, but to an independent body. Off-the-record briefings to be replaced by non-reportable briefings. Caution to be used in accepting hospitality from journalists. Principles would usefully apply to reporting of terrorism. How near are we to acceptance of these recommendations? So Neil, if I can pass that to you. Sorry, I think you're muted.
Of course. So what I wanted to say when I raised my hand was just a couple of things on Ian's point. Is I'm going to get Ian to call me Neil before this call finishes as part of establishing a relationship. Mr. Bassett sounds incredibly formal. Alex hopefully knows that we are, those guidelines have been in place for many years now and are almost completely adhered to, and certainly by senior officers, where a lot of the Leveson allegations were made. I had the advantage of being the senior officer in charge of the post-Leveson investigation. I took over from Sue Akers, and I've run it for 7 years. So I kind of know where we are in that space. And I'm one of those people who has to report every contact with journalists every month. Now, what we don't do is we don't say, and by the way, this is a full transcript of our conversation. We say, I met this journalist on this professional point on this day. We are perfectly entitled to have non-reportable briefings with journalists, and we make that very clear. I've met some very senior editors recently, in which it's been very clear in that bilateral conversation, without a communications professional present to record it all, is that we are having a conversation about our relationship and an education about how we both want to work together. That is perfectly acceptable behaviour. Now, I did used to say to some of my senior colleagues, most journalists, security correspondents, crime correspondents, CRA members that I've met in my life would be very willing to meet you in your office over a cup of coffee. There is no necessarily, it is not necessary to be arranging gifts and hospitality and big lunches, and we're interested in the story. We're both interested in the story. We will meet professionally wherever we need to meet to discuss that story. So I would say the Leveson guidelines are fully in and fully understood. But unfortunately, there was a freezing effect of those guidelines when they first came in, and trying to get to a point where you still feel comfortable in having that relationship, that conversation, that reportable and non-reportable conversation. There is no doubt whatsoever when they first came in, it stopped a lot of people wanting to have those conversations because of an allegation that something untoward was going on. And by the way, having been the lead investigator in that, that is actually a remarkably rare occurrence.
Neil, can I ask you one other question while you're talking? An upvoted question from Keelan, talking about impact. Have you ever seen a case of radicalisation or terrorism where there was a link that you could establish between the reporting of terrorism and an event?
Yes, so yes is the short answer. We have examples. In fact, this is more germane to social media, without a doubt. So social media is my biggest problem. I've been talking about it in a keynote speech this morning. Mark talked about it extensively in this role and outside of this role. Every single terrorist that we investigate and convict, regardless of their ideology, their mindset is delivered. When we arrest them and we find out what they've been doing, we find a huge amount of material, either scraped from social media, from propaganda that's been delivered by terrorist organizations, or stuff that they have been researching by effectively looking at news stories and then being led to sites or making searches based on the news media that they've read. It's actually quite rare for them to do it from mainstream media compared to social media, but every mainstream media outlet has an online presence now. And the actual, what I say when we're having conversations about how we can be more responsible about this is we can give you guidance about things that you can do to prevent it being easy for somebody who's curious to suddenly being lured into a site where they will see some of the most extreme imagery. We can help people with that. I was talking about a case this morning where a young boy is effectively being radicalized for years on the internet. His parents didn't know. How many of us are online savvy enough to understand the security of our children? This was a straight A student, somebody who should have been going to Oxford or Cambridge. Very nearly, if the judge hadn't suspended the sentence, would have been going to a top prison. And by the time we actually found out what he was doing, we're 2 years down the line and he's already at the bottom of a rabbit hole. You know, how do we stop people getting there in the first place? This is part of this conversation. It's part of the conversation that needs to be had with social media. But there are countless examples of mindset being developed, increased, becoming acutely focused on very vulnerable people who get very fixated on this material. You know, I'm not saying that's the broad, thank God, otherwise I'd never go home. You know, that is a small section of our population who are vulnerable and malleable around this stuff, but it really is having an impact on them.
Thanks very much for that. In what I fear may be one of our last questions, because bear in mind, panelists, I'm going to ask you to kind of give a closing 30 seconds, I think, of wrapping up for your future priority on the subject before we say goodbye. There was a question that came in early from Neil Bennett. And this one is for Jess. And Neil points out that, the paper does talk about focus less on perpetrators and more on victims because of this fear of glorifying terrorism. But his question is about, is this the priority in the right place? People want information, audiences want to know about who the perpetrators are and why they are doing these things, which people find so very hard to understand. Can you reflect on that for us?
Yeah, this was certainly a question that was reflected, with great consideration by a lot of the interviewees as well. As I'm just sort of reflecting what I've learned from those interviews, in that this is a difficult line to walk, because yes, you want to tell the story, and it's necessary to tell the story of how a person gets to this place of committing an act of terrorism, and that's of public interest and is of value. But I think I would say, especially in the immediate aftermath of an incident, when you're, reporting on sort of what's going on right now, I think it does help to reduce the immediate glorification of these people or their acts by sort of focusing on what might be, first responders or public response or the victims and their stories in a way to reduce that sort of immediate glorification, and perhaps come back to or include in a less primary way the story of the terrorists themselves and how they got to committing that act.
Thanks very much, Jess. I think we're in the final kind of few minutes now of this event. So I mentioned that I would ask the panelists to kind of give a final closing thought. Jess, perhaps if I can come to you first. I know it's been your paper and you've given us a lot of your thoughts, but is there one thing that you would like to emphasize to close for us?
I mean, this certainly wasn't my area of expertise when I started out, and I have learned a lot going down this road of some very interesting conversations with a lot of different people from different walks. I think the one thing that stood out to me, and the one thing I tried to make stand out in the report, is the importance of sort of this understanding being ingrained before the next terrorist attack happens. Take the quiet time to learn the lessons and help each other see the perspectives, and then the next time it comes around to this sort of heat of the moment incidents, you might be better prepared to sort of approach and remember these issues as they come up in the live incidents. That's really what stuck out to me, I think, as everyone, I think, is legitimately trying to do a good job and to do an important job in protecting democracy. But there are lessons that can be learned in the quiet times between the storm.
Thanks, Jess. If I can ask Ian now for your final 30 seconds of reflections.
Absolutely. Well, I think the report really takes this matter forward. It makes some very valid and interesting points that's there. So thank you once again, Jess, for all your hard work on that. I think the understanding reinforced for me is that the police and the media are on the same side. We'll never be completely hand in glove, but there are ways that we can find to work closer together for the good of the public.
Thank you, Ian. And Charlotte, the same for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is fundamentally about relationship building. And I think we all recognize that this is a particularly difficult time to build relationships. There are huge barriers imposed by COVID on that. But I think it's really, I always say, if an event isn't in the diary, it doesn't happen. That's just it's obvious nonsense, but it's also true. And I think it is really important for us to get some events in the diary so that this work gets taken forward, because I think it's, as Jess says, sadly, there will be another attack, and it would be a really good thing if we could all be better prepared.
Thanks, Charlotte. And Neil, the final 30 seconds, thank you.
Thank you. I'm not naive enough to think that we will have this all sorted by the time the next attack happens. I know you don't want to hear that from the head of UKCT, but that's just a reality. But Jess will forgive us. We didn't wait for Jess's report to start on a programme of work to work on the things that Jess was telling us she was finding out as she was going along. So we are working on those relationships, not just people like me, but from my senior investigating officers and upwards, an educational programme for my people and my communications professionals. And what we want to do is run briefings for journalists so that we can work together and build that social capital. We've already applied to be members of the DSMA committee so that we can do exactly what Ian described that committee is for. We will continue to provide evidence of impact to editors and journalists so that they understand what we're seeing in our casework. And we want to get that communications guidance, both the lexicon of how we speak, into some form of guidance, non-prescriptive. Jess, you used the word many times, thank you for doing that. We're not trying to be prescriptive. It will fall to the choice of the editors, but we do want to work with editors and journalists to produce lexicon and guidance that can be both on the IPSO website and can be used in journalism schools for the next generation. And we're doing all of that, and we've invested in that programme of work, and we will continue thanks to Jess as well.
Thanks very much, Neil, and it's now 3:30, so all that remains really is for me to thank everybody who attended for coming along. I'm really sorry that we couldn't get to all of the questions. To thank our panel, Assistant Commissioner Neil Basu, Dr. Jess White from RUSI, IPSO's Charlotte Dewar, and Executive Director of the Society of Editors, Ian Murray. As I mentioned, the event's going to be posted online. The report is embargoed until 4 o'clock. Do use social media to talk about it then. And if you enjoyed this event, RUSI's got a lot more events coming up. You could consider joining us again on Monday. There are 2 panels on Boko Haram. The title is Boko Haram's Past, Present and Future. They begin at 2 o'clock, and I'll be part of the second panel on counterterrorism. But thank you very much, everyone, for coming along. Well done, Jess, on a fantastic research paper. And enjoy the rest of your week, and perhaps we'll see some of you on Monday. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Liz. Goodbye.